Good morning, friends. Today, I want to tell you a story. It is the story of one woman and her family and how they were affected by a terrible tragedy. Let me introduce you to the characters in my story. Harriet Bentley is 32 years old, a mother. Her husband is Cogswell Bentley. They have 4 daughters, Harriet, Barbara, Dorothea, and Martha. Harriet's parents are also a prominent part of my story. The time is 1918. The setting is Rochester. Note the name of my presentation, Become What Thou Art. Be on the lookout for the reason why this name was chosen. We will also talk about the Spanish flu pandemic in Rochester in 1918 and compare it to our experience today. Some researchers have reported that after the flu swept through Rochester in 10 weeks in 1918, life returned to normal and people forgot about their suffering. However, I will introduce you to 4 women who lived with the heartache of this tragedy for their entire lives. Are we ready? Let's get started. See, it's not going. Life appeared very promising for the handsome young Bentley couple as they strolled together down Newcastle Road in the fall of 1918. In July, their new home had been finished and the family had moved in. The house, a gift from Harriet's parents, was one of the first houses on Newcastle Road, a rural area on the border of the city of Rochester. Harriet had worked closely with architect Hugh Crisp as he designed the house. The house was large and comfortable, filled with nooks and crannies waiting to be discovered by the 3 Bentley girls, Harriet, age 8, Barbara, age 6, and Dorothea, age 4. Off each bedroom, there were open porches providing fresh air to promote good health and prevent tuberculosis. There was plenty of room for the children and the nanny, as well as the new baby expected in December. The woods surrounding their home in the prestigious new Browncroft development were a paradise to Harriet and her husband Cogswell. They planned to build a tennis court on the property behind their house, as they were both avid tennis players. Harriet Jackson Benton was born on December 8, 1885, the only surviving child of Charles Benton and Harriet Maria Drown in Sharon, Litchfield County, Connecticut, where her father had a dairy farm. Both of her parents traced their ancestry back to the Mayflower. Her father, Charles Benton, had served in the Dutchess County Regiment, the 150th New York State Volunteers, during the Civil War. This is her father, and Harriet is standing next to him. Years later, in 1902, he published a book entitled As Seen from the Ranks, A Boy in the Civil War, in which he described his war experiences. In the fall of 1891, when Harriet was 5 years old, her maternal grandfather died and her family moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts to care for her grandmother and the family estate. The Drown family had been successful merchants in New Bedford, selling food to ship companies. Harriet spent her childhood and attended the Friends School there. Here she is with her parents and her grandmother. She joined the North Congregational Church in New Bedford as a young woman. Harriet graduated from Vassar in 1907 with an AB degree, following in the footsteps of her mother, who was in the class of 1871. Vassar was the first college to offer a full university program for women. Harriet's mother had enrolled in the fall of 1866, just 1 year after the school opened. Harriet met Cogswell Bentley the summer after her graduation from Vassar. While visiting classmates in Rochester, she was introduced to the distinguished young Yale graduate just starting a law practice in his hometown. Their courtship included many train rides between New Bedford and Rochester. Cogswell, the son of Sardius Bentley and Martha Cogswell Bentley, came from a prominent Rochester family. Both Sardius Bentley and his father-in-law, Thomas Cogswell, were noted local attorneys. The family home at 7 Prince Street was a center of social life for Cogswell and his 5 brothers. Cogswell and Harriet were married on August 7, 1909, at Harriet's home in New Bedford. Cogswell was the first of the 6 Bentley brothers to be married, and the wedding was an elegant occasion. The Bentley family was very active in the Third Presbyterian Church on the corner of East Avenue and Meg Street. When Harriet married, she brought a letter from her church in New Bedford and officially joined the Third Presbyterian Church. Cogswell was a church trustee at the time. Harriet and Cogswell were a loving couple who shared many interests. They enjoyed music, both classical and opera. Harriet's 2 oldest daughters, Harriet and Barbara, recall their mother sitting at the piano bench with a daughter on each side while she played the piano and sang. Harriet and Cogswell both shared a love of nature and the outdoors. They enjoyed taking long walks in the woods and in winter sledding and romping in the snow. They loved camping and even went camping on their honeymoon. They would take week-long canoe camping trips into Canada with their friends, portaging from lake to lake. Cogswell was an experienced camper and had learned canoeing from Indian guides. They enjoyed the self-sufficiency of carrying everything that they needed on their shoulders, living in a tent, building a campfire, and cooking freshly caught fish. Gardening was another interest that Harriet and Cogswell shared. They had a large vegetable garden in an adjacent lot behind their home. In addition to vegetables, they planted apple and peach trees and had currants and gooseberries. A cherished family photograph depicts Harriet and Cogswell with their 4-year-old daughter, Dorothea, in the vegetable garden on September 27th, 1918. This was Dorothea's 4th birthday. On the back of this photo, Cogswell had written, "Harriet's last picture." This precious photo was taken 1 day before the flu epidemic began in Rochester, the day that 2 soldiers home on furlough had become seriously ill with the flu. Harriet, having had the advantage of a fine education, was interested in providing her daughters and other children in the community with the best educational opportunities. She was fascinated with the innovative work of Maria Montessori, the Italian physician turned educator, who had become a pioneer in early childhood education. As a result of her work in the slums of Rome, Montessori had observed how children learn. She had prepared an environment for children using special instructional materials. Without direct instruction, the children learned to read and write at an early age. In the spring of 1917, Harriet Bentley gathered together a group of mothers from different social circles to discuss setting up a school experience for 4-year-olds. At that time, many people were thinking about progressive education, and these parents were very serious about investigating the best of various methods in their children's education. The mothers consulted Mary Jane Miller of the City Normal School, and under her guidance decided to start a Montessori school. They hired a teacher from New York City who had studied under Maria Montessori in Rome. They called their school the Children's University School of Rochester. The school was to be democratic, with scholarships for less privileged children. It was cooperative, with the parents and teachers operating the school together. It opened in the summer of 1917 with 10 students in the front rooms of a house on Oxford Street. In the winter of 1918, it moved to a tailor shop on Park Avenue. The tuition was $8 per month. Mothers were responsible for paying the bills, furnishing the school, preparing lunches, transporting the students, and in some cases, even teaching. Harriet Bentley became the first president of the Board of Mothers. So it was that 3 years before women were given the right to vote in the United States, Harriet Bentley and a group of Rochester women had the initiative to start a school. Their efforts were not universally endorsed, and these women were criticized for shirking their responsibilities as mothers. To start a school using the ideas of Maria Montessori was a revolutionary concept in 1917. It was only a year later, however, that tragedy struck the Rochester community, as well as the young idealistic founder of the innovative new school. The influenza that forever altered the lives of the Bentley family on Newcastle Road was part of a worldwide pandemic. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 had been called the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. It killed between 20 and 40 million people worldwide. In the United States, it killed more people than all the wars in the 20th century put together. 20 million became ill with influenza, and 675,000 died, all within 10 months. Of the American soldiers who died in World War I, it is estimated that 85 out of 100 were killed, not in battle, but by the flu. The initial wave affected soldiers and spread rapidly because soldiers were crowded into barracks or ships. Because influenza is a respiratory disease, it is contracted by breathing. As we well know today, a person who was infected could cough, sneeze, and breathe out millions of flu germs into the air before knowing that he was sick. As our troops were sent to Europe, huge numbers became ill. Within a few months, however, the virus mutated, and when the troops returned to the United States, they brought with them a much more lethal form of the influenza virus. This second wave quickly entered the civilian population and spread across the country. It was the second wave that devastated the civilian population in Rochester. Although Monroe County suffered less than many communities, nearly 1,100 people died within 10 weeks. First mention of the influenza epidemic in Massachusetts appeared in the Rochester Times-Union on September 21st. And 4 days later, a group of nurses and doctors left Rochester to volunteer their services in Boston. On September 28th, 2 soldiers home on furlough became seriously ill with influenza, and the epidemic began. by October 7th, 400 cases were reported. 2 days later, schools and all places of amusement were closed. On October 12th, all churches, Sunday schools, soda fountains, ice cream parlors, meetings of lodges, social clubs, saloons, and bars closed. Florists were unable to get enough flowers for funeral displays. Cemeteries were overwhelmed as well. Graves could not be dug rapidly enough by hand, so a trench digger was put into service. On November 5th, schools, churches, theaters, and other places of assembly were allowed to reopen, and the number of cases rose sharply. Dr. Joseph Roby, the acting city public health official, expressed his frustration in this November 1918 report. Quote, "We were not prepared, we were not equipped, and by the time we were prepared and equipped, the wave of the epidemic was nearly over. We had lost hundreds of lives. Sorrow and suffering had been the lot of those left behind, the cup of grief of those in whose sorrow had been a large and brimming one. Because of the age periods 20 to 40, the most energetic and productive of all periods of life, in which most of the descendants died." While the military was able to closely monitor soldiers and put them to bed if they had a temperature, in Rochester, the civilian population was not so fortunate. People continued to work even though they were sick. Rochesterians, as well as Americans everywhere, wore gauze face masks, hoping they could avoid being infected. There was a severe shortage of nurses and doctors. 25% of local physicians were enlisted in the war. Because the hospitals were short-handed, nursing students handled most of the care in the hospitals. 50 of these students contracted the disease. The health authorities enrolled 200 volunteers as nurses and attendants. The city's 1 municipal and 4 private hospitals were filled. Local attorneys volunteered to wash dishes in hospitals. There was a shortage of hospital beds, especially for children, and there were no provisions for the convalescent of people who had survived the flu in a weakened state. Emergency hospitals, oh, here's a gentleman cleaning the streetcar, just like is done in the New York City subways. Emergency hospitals were set up all over town. The Red Cross enlisted hundreds of amateur nurses to staff these temporary hospitals. The Red Cross organized a volunteer nursing service, a women's motor corps, and a food corps. The Medical Motor Service of Rochester was begun to transport nurses to homes. In the newspapers, people could read these guidelines that were put into the paper every week from Dr. Joseph Roby, the acting health officer. Now, this will remind you of our daily TV shows by Governor Cuomo, where he gives us similar precautions. And let's look at some of the different ones that Dr. Roby has put on that may be a little bit more creative compared to what Governor Cuomo talks about. People ought to keep away from others. Avoid crowds in church, theater, stores, or parties, or elsewhere. Don't go to funerals. See that there is a vacant seat on either side of you. Number 2, don't talk so much and don't exchange spit when talking. 3, keep at arm's length, cane length, umbrella length. Women might use a hat pin in the extended arm. People may be spitting disease and death at you in trivial talk. Carry a yardstick as a cane and hold it horizontally. If people get influenza, let them go to bed. Don't use disinfectants. Use paper napkins if you have a cold, and then burn them. Wash your hands and face before and after meals and after leaving the toilet. Scrub your teeth on rising, after meals, and before bedtime. Use dental floss. See that your nose is in good breathing condition. Don't use sprays. Consult your doctor. Let quacks and patent medicines alone. If you wear glasses, wash them too. Look at the fine spots of spit which others have spat at your glasses when talking to you. Above all, don't grunt and tell your troubles to others, for everyone has troubles of his own. But look at the bright side and lighten your face with a smile. I think we could share some of those recommendations with Governor Cuomo. Here's a wonderful slide when the schools were closed. We see that elementary teachers had to go look for their children to make sure that there was someone alive in the house to take care of them. And the senior high teachers and principal and the senior high students would go out and work on farms. And here is a farm in Pittsford with teachers bringing in the harvest. This is a wonderful photo from Rochester. One solution, kissing through a handkerchief. But it did nothing to deter the spread of the influenza virus. The entire medical community was humbled by this epidemic. Until this event, there was euphoria and a feeling that Americans were invincible. We could help Europe win the war. We could develop vaccines for any disease. This strain of the influenza, however, was unlike any other. The medical profession did not know its cause, and many myths arose as to how to treat the disease. During these tragic months from September to December 1918, while health officials were encouraging people to stay away from crowds, parades were held, and there were numerous gatherings downtown to sell war bonds. These were the final months of World War I. Patriotism was high, and the government encouraged such demonstrations of support for the war effort. Unfortunately, these gatherings allowed the flu to spread and claim many more lives. There was no law, no facial covering, no reprimand that could halt the spread of Spanish influenza. No one could prevent it. No one could cure it. Let's take a few minutes to compare and contrast our COVID-19 pandemic in Rochester and the 1918 Spanish flu. Firstly, Rochester suffered many more deaths in 1918. The estimate is 1,100, but it may have been much higher because it was difficult to count how many people died, basically in a 10-week period. Today, Rochester's death rate is almost 250. Dr. Roby complained that the doctors were not reporting deaths, but in reality, doctors were so overwhelmed they did not have time to do the paperwork required, or perhaps they themselves had died. The Rochester DNC has our pandemic as front page news. In 1918, it was relegated to inside pages in local newspapers because the war was consistently front page news. Today's newspapers list the number of deceased each day, but gives no personal information about the decedents. In 1918, the newspapers listed names, ages, and addresses of those who died each day. In 1918, citizens depended on one of Rochester's many newspapers for updates on the pandemic locally. Today, we rely on CNN and the media for 24-hour news. There was a critical shortage of nurses and doctors in 19 because many had been recruited in the war or to work in hospitals in Boston. Only older, less robust doctors remained, along with student nurses who lived in dorms at their hospitals. Many of them succumbed to the virus themselves. As a result, many civilians were recruited to take care of the sick. In 1918, Rochester's hospitals, St. Mary's General, Heinemann, which is Highland Hospital, and the homeopathic, which is we call Geneseo Hospital, the municipal hospital, they were overwhelmed. And other places like Baden Street Settlement, Lewis Street Settlement, the Gannett House, the YWCA, the Armory, the Salvation Army, church halls, and vacant mansions were opened all over town as mini hospitals and remained open until the end of November. Today's hospitals have been able to contain the COVID-19 patients. When schools were closed, teachers were sent out to see if their students were safe, and others were sent to help farmers harvest their crops. Today's teachers try to continue instruction with their students via Zoom, while at the same time checking to make sure that their students are safe and have enough food. One startling difference between then and now was the age group affected. In 1918, the deadliest target was young men and women between the ages of 18 and 45, the people in the most productive years of their lives. This meant that the city needed to find a place for children whose parents were hospitalized or had died. The teachers were sent out to find children who had no one to take care of them. Today, the largest percentage of people dying are older citizens. In 1918, people went to work even if they were sick. Rochesterians were patriotic and eagerly contributed to the war effort. Rochester factories were busy producing military uniforms, boots for soldiers, weapons, and precision instruments like lenses and cameras. Rochester was an essential manufacturing center with a much larger population than today. The workforce believed that its role in helping to win the war was as important as fighting in the trenches. Everyone had to play a role to win the war. People needed to work in order to survive. Today, there is a safety net provided by the government, like unemployment insurance, to encourage workers to stay home, and factories and businesses are closed to prevent the spread of the virus. In 1918, the local government was in charge, and neighbors had to help neighbors. People delivered foods to homes, and today's volunteers work at food cupboards. When it comes to following the advice of the medical experts, people in Rochester have not changed over the years. Both then and now, people did not follow the rules. When the Rochester bars were closed, for example, people streamed to bars in Brighton. When people were supposed to stay 6 feet apart, they went to parades and rallies, just like today when people attend marches with thousands of people. Both then and now, however, the spirit of Rochester remains the same, with people reaching out to help their neighbors. We're fortunate to live in such a caring community. Now, back to our story. In late November, Harriet's 8-year-old daughter was sent home from school with a temperature. Along with many of her classmates at School 23, she had contracted the flu. There were few nurses available, and local hospitals were overwhelmed with flu victims. And there was a severe shortage of facilities for children. Harriet took care of her daughter herself, sending her other school-age daughter, Barbara, to stay with her grandparents on Prince Street. Harriet's third daughter, Dorothea, remained at home but was isolated in a separate part of the house with a nanny. On November 29th, Harriet became ill herself, a victim of the deadly second wave. Her family doctor, Dr. Charles Witherspoon, was summoned to the house and immediately diagnosed her illness as the flu. On December 4th, Harriet's fourth daughter, Martha Cogswell, was born. She was named after her paternal grandmother, whose maiden name was Cogswell. Harriet developed pneumonia and tragically died 3 days later on December 7th. On December 8th, Harriet would have been 33 years old. How were these children affected by the death of their mother? Did they forget her and move on with their lives? Let's listen to their own words. My first essay is written by Harriet, the oldest child. This was her in 1918, and this was Harriet in 2005. I am 90 years old, and the saddest day of my life was December 7th, 1918, when I lost my mother. I was only 8 years old when Mother died, and I have never been able to stop thinking that her death was my fault. In November 1918, I was in third grade at School 23. When I arrived at school one morning, I felt hot, and the teacher immediately sent me to the office. In those days, there was a dreadful epidemic in Rochester, and everyone was frightened of getting the Spanish flu. I was immediately sent home from school, and my mother contacted our family physician, Dr. Witherspoon. He came to my house, examined me, and told Mother that I definitely had the flu. Mother sent my sister Barbara to my grandparents' house, and my youngest sister, Dorothea, was isolated in the downstairs with our nanny. Mother took care of me day and night and never left my side. Many people later wondered why my mother did not take me to a hospital or hire someone to look after me. In those days, however, all the hospitals were overwhelmed with flu victims. Most nurses had been sent to Europe to serve in the war. My mother was so attentive to me, and soon my fever broke and I began to eat and get stronger. However, as I recovered, Mother became ill herself. Dr. Witherspoon returned and was very worried about Mother. All of a sudden, there was a lot of commotion in our house. I recall my father coming into my bedroom to tell me that I had a new sister. 3 days later, I was told that Mother had died. I will never forget how desperate I felt. I was Bentley girl number 1, and Mother and I were so close. She was such a kind and warm-hearted mother with a wonderful personality, generous and thoughtful of others. She was much loved by all who knew her, and I could not imagine my life without my mother. The wake, the funeral, the days of anguish following this tragic time are like a blur in my memory. Not a day goes by that I do not miss her. Harriet, Bentley girl number 1. My second piece was written by Barbara. Here she is in 1918, and here is Barbara in 2005. I remember Mother's death so vividly, although it was so long ago. When my sister came home from school with the dreaded flu in late November, Mother immediately sent me to my grandparents' home on Prince Street. My grandmother walked me to school each day and tried to make my life as normal as possible. I missed Mother terribly and wanted to go home, especially when I was told that I had a new baby sister. I recall the day that Father came to see me and told me that Mother had died. I was so confused. He told me that he was going to take me home to say goodbye to Mother. When we got home, there were many people crying and lots of commotion. Father took my hand and we went upstairs to my parents' bedroom. The door was closed. As he was about to open the door, he told me that I could say goodbye to Mother. As he opened the door, I could see Mother lying in bed, so still. Father was crying and he took my hand to lead me to the bed. I immediately pulled back and cried, "No, Father, I do not want to go in, I'm scared." I ran out into the hallway. The next day, Mother was put into a casket on a bier in the living room, as was the custom at that time. I recall that the house was bustling with visitors who came to look at Mother and express their sorrow. What I recall about those days was sheer confusion and shock. She was laid out, and on the third day, the funeral took place in our living room with our minister, Reverend Strayer. After the funeral, my grandmother dressed us in our best clothes, and we rode together in a carriage to Mount Hope Cemetery. There was a large chapel in the cemetery, and we all gathered there and prayed. There were so many people. I saw my mother's coffin in the front of the church. After this service, we went home, to our home, without my mother. We girls were completely lost. When I think back on those tragic days, I often regret not having said goodbye to Mother as my father requested. I was only 6 years old. My mother had been the center of my life. Barbara, Bentley girl number 2. Now I will read a letter from the daughter of Dorothea. Here she is in 1918. And here is Dorothea in 2005. My name is Dolly, and my mother was Dorothea Bentley, Harriet's third daughter. My mother was only 4 years old when her mother died in the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918. However, I can tell you that my mother's entire life was affected by the loss of her mother at such an early age. My mother grieved for her mother all her life. When my grandmother and her friends started the Children's University School of Rochester, Dorothea was in the nursery class. Now, my mother is living with us and suffering from Alzheimer's disease. However, her memory of her mother remains vivid. When she heard a lady from Rochester was writing an article about Harriet Bentley, she was excited. When we received the article, I read it to my mother when I put her to bed, and her eyes filled up with tears. I left it on her bedstand when I tucked her into bed that night. When I later went in to check on her, she was sleeping with the article in her arms. Dolly Bunting, daughter of Dorothea, Bentley girl number 3. Harriet's father, overwhelmed with grief, wrote a 4-page tribute to his beloved daughter entitled Mrs. Harriet Benton Bentley by her father. I'm going to read you just a part of it. In the full, rich June of her womanhood, the personification of health, buoyant vitality, good cheer, and friendship, our daughter was taken away, and the grief and confusion left in the household are indescribable. But I am writing a few lines for the information of those who may come after. And then he describes her life. I'll go on. After this brief outline of her life, I should follow with some, however imperfect, appreciation of her character and personality. But I find this to be a very difficult task, perhaps because she was so near to me, for no closer attachment ever was known between father and daughter than there was betwixt us. From earliest childhood, she showed some strong traits of character which were recognized by those nearest to her, and one of these was her sense of justice. This led her, even at an early age, to readily recognize the rights of others, and it also led her many times to recognize her own rights and insist on their being granted, although she was ever ready to yield a point in the interests of peace. She was a most cheerful person, and it may be said without exaggeration that she was the very soul of optimism. When she was a child and was going anywhere, she always expected to have a good time. And when she returned, she always said that she never had such a good time before. This joy of life was with her all her days, down to the day of her death. She had joy in her friendships, joy in her school days, joy in her married life and homemaking, and especially did she have joy in her motherhood. When the World War came on, and especially after the entrance of the United States into the struggle, she was caught in the national impulse of patriotism and applied herself in every possible way to the country's service. She remarked one day, rather humorously, that she could never understand, even in childhood, how one of my temperament ever came to enlist to go to war, but that since we had entered this war, she could understand it quite clearly. So strongly did she feel the impulse of patriotism that if she had been a man, she said, she would have certainly enlisted. And even as it was, except for her responsibilities, she would have devoted herself in some way to the national service. From what I have written, it will be readily understood that with her many attractive qualities and her large facility for friendship, she was one to make many friends, and she did. I don't think I ever knew anyone so universally popular among all classes as she was. After her death, we were simply overwhelmed with notes and letters of sympathy, and most of them were not of the formal kind, but expressed the deepest feeling. And so, after all is said and done, it is a very happy life which has closed so suddenly, and a rarely beautiful and attractive personality which has gone from us. And though we are overwhelmed by sorrow, and especially by the suddenness of our loss, yet we comfort ourselves by reflecting that this happy life, this attractive personality, was ours for nearly a third of a century, enriching our experience and leaving as a heritage a memory fragrant with cheerfulness, friendship, kindness, and just everyday goodness. Few there are who have their sorrow tempered by such rich memories. Charles E. Benton. The vision of Harriet Bentley and her friends in 1917 lives on in Rochester today. In January 1924, 5 years after her death, the Children's University School of Rochester was incorporated by the state of New York under the name Harley, combining the first 3 letters and the last 3 letters of Harriet Bentley's name and commemorating her as the school's founder. It was her dedication and inspiration, as well as her executive abilities and vision, which gave permanence and influence to the school. Harley was the first independent school chartered by New York State in the Rochester area. The motto of the Harley School is, "Become what thou art." While Harriet's life was cut short by the terrible influenza epidemic of 1918, her legacy continues in the school that bears her name and dreams her dreams. The one child that regretfully I did not contact was Martha, Bentley girl number 4, who was only 3 days old when her mother died. In spite of her precarious entry into this world, Martha Cogswell Bentley became a Renaissance woman, living a long life of accomplishment. Martha died in 1905, in 2005, and is buried directly behind her mother in Mount Hope Cemetery. Martha served in World War II as a coder in the Coast Guard. She was a librarian in Queens and Santa Rosa, California. After her retirement, she devoted her life to conservation and started a bird rescue program in her community. Martha Cogswell Bentley will be the topic of a future article in our Epitaph newsletter. She is definitely one of the notable women of Mount Hope Cemetery. Our final family photograph, taken in early 1919, is one that culminates my story. Look at the faces of these children and their father in front of their home. How their lives have changed in just a few months. And think of all the other families who experienced such losses in 1918, as well as people in our midst who have lost loved ones today. In conclusion, my research on the life of Harriet Bentley has been an incredible experience for me personally. Having the opportunity to communicate in letters and phone calls with 2 of Harriet's daughters and her granddaughter was a great honor. These women were so gracious and eager to share their most heartfelt memories of their mother and her untimely death. Barbara especially shared delightful vignettes of her childhood as Bentley girl number 2. It was apparent that these women had inherited their mother's attributes of being kind, friendly, and cheerful. When my article was published, I received a lovely bouquet of flowers from Harriet, Bentley girl number 1, such a thoughtful gesture. All of these women gave me a glimpse into the lives of this wonderful family on Newcastle Road. I am forever grateful to them. So, to Harriet, her husband, her daughters, and her parents, may you rest in peace. May your memories be a blessing.
can just hit stop share.
At this point, we can open it up for questions. So feel free to go ahead and unmute yourselves or to put questions in the chat area for Pat.
This is Cynthia Hauk. Am I unmuted?
You are.
This was wonderful. I had the pleasure of talking with Bentley girl number 4, Martha, who was very accomplished, and we can talk off camera at some time about my discussions with her and her description of how she and her sisters played in what they called the tea house that was in the backyard of their next door neighbor. But could you mention, with the death of their mother right after the birth of the 4th child, do you have a little information? Their father remarried, so they did not grow up in a single parent household.
I have a lot of information, and Phyllis is a wonderful informant, and I've had the great honor. She's Bentley girl number 6. I've had the honor of.
That's who that's who I talked with, was
Right.
Phyllis. Is she still alive?
She's not in very good health right now.
Mm-hmm.
But she's been kind enough to meet with me and to show me scrapbooks of her life when she was the youngest of the 6 Bentley girls. So after Harriet died and her husband was left with these 4 children, he had a hard time finding a nanny because, as Barbara said, the children were very naughty. So he was able to contact some friends in Massachusetts, and he was able to get a nanny to come from Massachusetts and live with them. And this woman's name was Gladys, and she loved these children very much, and the feeling was mutual. As a matter of fact, when I first contacted Barbara and I said, I want to write an article about your mother, Barbara said, which mother? I found it so touching that she loved both of her mothers. So then not only did the children fall in love with Gladys, but the father did, and they got married.
Good heavens, it sounds like the sound of music.
It does. And then they had 2 more girls. So they were a family of 6 girls. So
Thank you.
Pat, there was a question in the chat. When did Cogswell die?
I don't have the dates when he died. I should go back to his gravestone that I showed you, but I don't have it right now.
And did they continue to live in the house until they were grown?
They did. They did live in that house. So Phyllis, the one that Cynthia was just mentioning, she has wonderful stories of that house as well.
Pat, my name is Molly Bentley. Harriet's my great aunt.
Yeah.
Oh, and I can't, I'm going to get emotional. I can't tell you how wonderful this was to hear about her life. There was so much that I didn't know. My father was Charles Bentley, and his Cogswell and Livingston, they were all his uncles. So Cogswell is my dad's uncle, and my cousin is on here too, Barbara Hall. But I had a question for you.
I want to meet all of you.
My father passed away 3 years ago. But the question is, and I think maybe it's obvious, but what role did her pregnancy, I didn't know she was pregnant, or she had just given birth when she died. What role did her pregnancy and having given birth, and she was probably exhausted, play in her succumbing to the influenza? And might she have lived had she not been weakened by giving birth?
Mm-hmm. This is something that we think about and talk about often. We did know from reading a lot about the Spanish influenza that pregnancy was an incredible danger at that time. But what this family knew about that, we don't know. Because now, many years later, we understand that it was very difficult. And so, did Harriet not know that she was, when she took care of her little daughter, that she might get the disease? But I've thought about it and talked about it to a lot of people. I was talking about it with Terry Lear. She's our local expert on the influenza epidemic. And I wonder if Harriet, being a woman that was in great physical condition, and yes, she was 9 months pregnant, I often wonder if, like any mother, when your child comes home from school and they're desperately ill.
Stop. Leads to the type of uprising that.
Wait a minute, can you hear me? Am I, okay.
Yes.
That like any mother, she would have taken care of her own child, because I bet that Harriet never dreamed that she would get the flu because she was so healthy. But these are all things that we just wonder about. We really don't know how it was. And remember, they lived on the outskirts of the city. So they felt, I'm sure, that the flu wouldn't get to them. And then it comes to them because their little daughter comes home from school. There's so many questions that we don't know the answer to.
Oops.
Yes, she gave birth at home to Emily. Yes.
Ruth Parker is also on. She's the iPad. She's also, Harriet was also her great aunt. So there's three of us on here.
Oh.
That,
Ruth.
and I did some research and I can name all six of the brothers, the Bentley brothers: Alex, Harold, Raymond, Cogswell. I had it written down too. Let's see, Alex.
Livingston.
Livingston. In fact, Livingston married my husband and I. He was a Presbyterian minister in Persia. And he was retired when he married my husband and I. But anyway, lots of history in that Bentley family. And the Bentleys and the Everests came together. Our grandmother married was an Everest who married Raymond Bentley.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of history.
And Livingston is the one that was a missionary. He's buried right near Cogswell. You know, they have a beautiful family plot at Mount Hope Cemetery, and I invite you all to come and I'll give you a tour. It's the Bentley family plot.
There's actually two. There's another plot also.
Mm-hmm.
Although I'm not sure whether it's a Bentley or an Everest, but I've been to the one with Cogswell and somebody showed us that. It's a ways from the other two plots.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So,
Pat, were there diaries, were there journals that either Cogswell or Harriet kept?
no, not that I know of. The photographs, the family photographs, were in the possession of Dolly Bunting, and she was kind enough to share those family photographs with me. That's why you can see how touching they are, because Dorothea seemed to have all the family photographs. And, but the women that I talked to, that was Harriet and Barbara, had written a lot of letters, and they wrote them to the Harley School because they would visit there occasionally, and they were kept in the archives of the Harley School. So those were wonderful resources that I had before I even met these women. And then after I met them, of course, we could talk. And they were such incredible informants. They told me I'd love to get together sometime after the pandemic with some of these relatives, because Barbara was a master storyteller, and she told me so many stories about their life on Newcastle Road, as did Phyllis. So I'm lucky. Those people are great resources.
It's amazing. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat. Do you know how the Rochester area was affected by the 1957 and 1968 flu pandemic?
No, I don't. I did want to add, for those of you that are really into 1918 pandemic, I wrote this article for the Epitaph in 2003, but in 2010, there was a thesis that was written by a gentleman named Daniel Cody. It's called Rochester Coughed, the 1918 Influenza Epidemic in Rochester, New York. It's a thesis that he wrote when he was at Brockport. You can see how gigantic it is. It's 200 pages, and it's available online. And what this young man did is every single day, he looked at newspapers, and then he listed the people that had died. So you could see during these 10 weeks, every day what was going on in Rochester. That's an incredible resource that wasn't available when I wrote this.
I've got a lot of family letters. I don't know what to do with them. I feel like I'm the keeper of a lot of stuff that, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do with it all.
I would suggest you give them to the Harley Archives, because they're very religious about taking care of everything to do with Harriet Bentley. As a matter of fact, I gave them all my primary documents.
Well, these don't pertain necessarily to Harriet, but just Bentleys, you know, some of the other Bentleys, and my grandmother and great-grandmother. And Molly, what happened to Granny's diaries?
Oh, I think I have some of those.
Oh, okay.
You know, I was reflecting, Pat, on that theme of environmental stewardship, and I don't know, is one that carried through the family. It's interesting to see how far back it went. You know, that Cogswell and Harriet liked to camp, and they liked to go canoeing, and they liked to garden. And I know that my grandmother, who would have been the wife of Charles, they were also Raymond. They were also environmentalists and pacifists very early. I mean, before, I don't want to say before it was fashionable, but it's interesting to me to see how far back that aesthetic goes, because that really stayed with members of the family. My dad ended up being a researcher who contributed to our understanding of climate change. So maybe he also got some of that aesthetic from his uncles, the elder generation.
Well, and Granny did Bentley's Woods outside over by Victor. She donated that land, to the Nature Conservancy. A long time ago. But Granny used to talk about going, and I wondered if she ever went on any of the trips with them to Canada, because she, would talk about carrying the canoes and portaging across, from lake to lake. And Ruth and I even took a backpack trip up into the Adirondacks, and we used Granny's old backpacks, and they were awful. They were terrible. The center of gravity was right there on the back of your bottom, and it was awful. Remember that, Ruth?
Phyllis, the woman that we were talking about, Bentley Girl number 6, she has some scrapbooks and photo albums, which would include the relatives after Harriet died, when Gladys was the mother. And she has a lot of pictures of all the cousins getting together.
Mm.
So.
I wanted to say I live in Harriet's house now.
Oh,
Wow.
where
Yeah.
are you?
Yeah. So I wanted to, once fall hits and maybe a little bit of time has gone by, and we can be around each other in a gathering, if everyone wanted to come over and go on a tour through the house, which is always a mess, but still here. There's some old wallpaper in closets. There's some, all the doorknobs are original. We're only the fourth people who lived here, fourth
Mhm.
owners. So if you guys wanted to look through, that would be really fun.
Emily, you were so kind to send me an email saying that you
Yeah.
now lived in Harriet's house and that you had some interesting paperwork.
Yeah, I have a document. There's a secret safe in the house. And in there is a document from between the architect and the lawyer speaking about what wood was used for the floors and what the maid section got, because there's a 2-room maid section at the back of the house. So it's pretty interesting to go through and read the sleeping porches. The floor was painted battleship gray. And, it's really detailed, but maybe I should be giving that to the Harley House for their archives. So, but if anyone wants to go through the house, we can try in fall or so.
Mm-hmm. Did you all think that that was a marvelous gift from her parents?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Being an only child is special. And the parents did live there as well until Harriet died. And I can't quite figure out when they got their own apartment, but.
Oh, wow.
Pat, it's obvious that you are drawn passionately into these stories of the lives of the residents of in the history of Rochester. Can you just say what it is that pulls you in? I mean, this had a natural draw for me, of course, because I'd heard about Harriet, but I didn't know the details. But what draws you in to tell these stories so faithfully?
Because we hear so much about statistics, and but it's very hard to figure out how people actually lived in those days, what their everyday life was like. So I'm always interested in trying to figure out something more personal about famous people. And of course, a lot of this, when we work at the Seward project at the U of R, the whole project focuses on what was a 19th century middle-class woman's life like. And so then we work on letters from William Seward's wife. But it's interesting to try to figure out what life was like during this pandemic. I think it makes it more personal and more interesting. So I have several women that I do research on. And as many of you know, because I notice many of you do a lot of writing, that when you're involved with one person, they sort of take over your body and you're living in their footsteps. Yes, it's scary, isn't it? And so you start to think about them all the time, and they become like your family too. I'm sure some of you have had that experience. It gets to the point where your family members say, enough already of Harriet Bentley, or enough already of Lillian Wald, people that I like to research. So
what are some of your upcoming projects?
One is to write about Martha Bentley, the youngest child. I have received from a relative named Barbara in California a great deal of material about this woman and what a fascinating woman she was. And I think you saw in my cemetery picture how she's buried right behind her mother. I mean, it's sort of beautiful. And there's a picture of a bird on her stone, and that's because she started a bird sanctuary, and she's very famous in Sonoma County. So she's one person. And then there's a man that I'm going to write an article about. And life goes on, right?
Pat, it's Cynthia Hauk again. And
Yes.
I wanted to mention, was it Molly that said about having letters and diaries and a lot of family materials with important information? Christine Radarski may want to comment, since she is an archivist and historian, what some of the options might be for those family materials, because our challenge when any of us do research, most families assume those materials are only of interest to their sisters and brothers in the immediate family. And for those of us that have research, these are golden primary resources. So maybe, is Christine Radarski still on camp? Christine, what would you say about the discussing letters and diaries in terms of donating them to archives?
Yes, and I want to reiterate your point that those are very important to the public record. So anytime families have materials like that, we encourage you to consider donating them to a public repository where they would be available to researchers. In my capacity, I manage the local history and genealogy division at the library, and we do have a large archive and special collections section there. It's one of our hidden gems that a lot of people don't know about. But other than the rare books and special collections at the University of Rochester, we are among the primary institutions in Rochester collecting local history materials. And we certainly are interested in anything that would document any of the families in our area. And this material is certainly falls into that category. I'm also the city historian for Rochester. And in that capacity, I also advise on other repositories. So I would be happy to talk to any of you family members to see what you have and what might be the best place for you to place those materials when you're ready to part with them. I did put my email in the chat. It's christine.radarski@libraryweb.org. So feel free to reach out to me at any point.
So yeah. Molly, do you live locally? Molly Bentley?
Yes, hi. No, I live in Oakland, and actually the woman who asked has all of our archivist, our family archivist. Barb is the one that has so many of the papers, but I do have a lot as well. I live in Oakland, California, and in fact, I think I have the.
Does Barbara live locally?
I think she's muted. I'll just finish this thought. I think we have the account of a Bentley who was a Civil War surgeon. I mean, we have his first person account of that time. So I'm really happy to possibly have a destination for those papers. It sounds like, Christine.
I live in Omaha. But the letters that Molly's referring to were written to his wife, Nellie. He would write his wife almost every single day. And so we had them bound up into a book, typed and bound up. I have a copy of the original letters. In fact, I ran into them the other day, but they were given to Yale. And I don't know if Yale, because that's where he went to school, but I don't think Yale's done anything to him and with them. And I have Nellie's cookbook. I've always wanted to do stuff from combine it. But I'm seriously, I have a ton of stuff. And Molly's got stuff. And I don't know if Ruth, she's on this also. She's got stuff. We've got a lot of history. I'm sorry I had to get up because the landscaper came and I have a dead bush. And I had to go answer the door.
Pat, can I show you a photo that might kind of interest you? Hang on.
Yes, certainly.
This is a photo of I don't know if you can see it, of this person in the middle. Can you see it?
Where are you, Molly?
Can you see the photo? I'm up.
Oh yeah, put it back. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's your dad, right?
So that gentleman in the middle is my father, who would have been Harriet's nephew in Antarctica, because he was an Antarctic scientist, doing measurements of the Antarctic ice sheet. So he went on to do these measurements of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which laid the groundwork for some of the climate change studies and our understanding of how Antarctica has been changing. That's all. I just happen to have that photo next to me, but it's since you're interested in his aunt, you know, that's what I was saying about how the aesthetic of caring for the environment continued. Anyway.
Pat?
Yes.
Hi, it's Margie Searle. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I just wanted to mention that, you know, the research that I've been doing on the Sibley and Watson families, and the Livingston Bentley was a childhood friend of James Sibley Watson Jr. He's referenced a number of times in family correspondence. So it's just always interesting locally to see the number of connections that there are amongst these families. Those papers are, one of the collections that he's mentioned in the most frequently is in the George Eastman Museum archive, of letters between James Sibley Watson Jr. and his cousin Erling. So anyway, just wanted to mention that. That's another tentacle, another rabbit hole.
Granny's house was on Old Mill Road. Am I muted? No. It was on Old Mill Road, which is right across the street from Harley School. And she was down at the very end, and her place was called Mill Ridge. And then her sister, Ruth, who married a Bentley, but first married a Ward, he died. And her place was just beyond, and it was called Sunning Hill. And it was right on the edge of the golf course, Rochester Country Club. But the Sibleys lived, the dad was friends with them. The Sibleys lived right there on the corner of Clover and Old Mill Road on the
different than the ones.
Sibley?
Pardon?
Is that a different Sibley family?
Well, I'm talking, I think, about a generation or earlier.
Right, right.
And they lived on Prince Street.
Yeah.
Right near the gallery. And I feel like the Bentleys lived not far.
They lived on, gosh, where did they live? On West Avenue? No, I've got it right here.
The Bentley house is number 7 Prince Street, and it was next
Right.
door to the Sibley Watson house. So that's why those
Right.
two little boys knew each other.
Right, exactly.
These people.
I think they had the impression that Livingston was a little bit of a was a goody-goody.
Oh. Yeah, it was not 7 Prince Street.
Right.
Home of Sardius and Martha.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was that childhood relationship. Anyway, it's fun to read how two teenagers are writing about someone they know, so who was Livingston. So.
Yeah, lots of history here.
Yeah.
Well, I think one thing we've learned is that people should not throw away family papers, and diaries, journals, just to find a place where they can be kept. Because other people will want to study them, especially letters where someone writes every single day. Those are just invaluable.
Yeah, he was there. He was at a lot of the big battles. He was at Gettysburg. He was at Lookout Mountain. He was from Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he lived. This is a picture of I don't know if you can see it, of Raymond Bentley, his brother. Yeah, it's a lot. It's almost a burden.
You know, Pat, your job and that of archivists in the future is going to be much harder when everything's in the computer and not in a box in the attic that you can spread out on the floor and look at. It must be so challenging for historians and it will be going forward, to put together the equivalent kind of history that you laid out here.
But there's a richness to it because everything can be done digitally now.
Right.
I don't know.
Just for example, all the letters that we transcribe from the Seward Project, they're all online. So it's such an incredible gift to the world, when we have people constantly transcribing these letters. So you can really see what life was like in those days. Of course, it costs a lot and it needs a lot of energy to do that. But
yeah.
And I want to just point out that sometimes people have things in their family records that they look at and think are boring. So sometimes I do a lot of research on farm families, and people will have kept daily farm journals where they're just recording, what they were planting and doing. And a lot of people look at those and think, oh, that's boring. Nobody wants that. But even that sort of thing is so invaluable. So I use that in my own research. So, don't look at anything and immediately dismiss it, because historians can find a lot of use for those sorts of things as well.
Do you think that you would be interested in the documents from the house?
Yes.
From the architect and the lawyer?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful. I'm sure Cynthia Houck would like to see those as well.
Right, because they're kind of starting to crumble around the edges, and it's rolled up. There's staples in it. So I was
Don't unroll. This is Cynthia Houck.
Yeah.
Do not unroll it, because it is, a lot of those are, the paper is fragile and it will crumble. So it's
Definitely.
better.
It looked like a carbon copy, or
Exactly. The house on Newcastle Road is remarkable because the architect Hugh Crisp did not do many other designs. We have some information in our file at the Landmark Society that talks about Mr. Crisp moved to Albany and I believe went into the contracting business. And a number of us that have visited the Newcastle Road house, because it's in a beautiful neighborhood, but it's the only one done by Mr. Crisp. We've often mentioned, too bad he didn't stay as in the architect field because of the beautiful design of the house on Newcastle. Can you imagine what other houses he may have designed should he? So there are not a lot of Hugh Crisp designs in existence. So that you have some of the materials that we call specifications when they're telling you how to paint the floor or what kind of wood to use.
Yeah.
So, but please do not unroll them till you talk to somebody who works with archives. And we have an excellent paper conservator, Gary Albright in Honey Eye Falls, who would be a good reference person. But leave them folded. If they've been rolled a long time, leave them rolled up.
Okay. Great, thank you.
And remember, Molly, that Harriet and Cogswell, they sat down with Mr. Crisp because they had certain desires for the layout of that house, and it involved good health for their children. So isn't it tragic that Harriet dies when they were mostly worried about tuberculosis, as many people were at that time. So those papers are going to be very interesting.
Pat, may I interject just one last thing? It's Margie again.
Yes, Margie.
Okay. I was just going through my database of Sibley and Watson materials, and I found that James Sibley Watson Jr. every Christmas in the 60s and 70s sent a check for $2,000 to Livingston Bentley. So,
because he was the missionary, right?
Right, but I think he was back here by that point. He must have been getting along in years, but I don't know where, I don't know where he was necessarily at that point, but I just think that's quite a nice sum of money too. And I think he also remembered him in his will, in Sibley's will.
So what were the years, Marjorie?
In the 60s and the 70s.
Oh, okay, because
Every December, he sent him a check.
He married my husband and I in 1975, and he was in the Syracuse area.
Okay, so that's just a testament to the enduring quality, I think, of their friendship.
Yes.
Okay, and with that, we're just a little bit over time now, so we're going to have to end our program here. It's been a lively discussion, and Pat, thank you so much for sharing. What a wonderful story. And as I noted, my email is in the chat. It's christine.radarski@libraryweb.org. So if anybody does want to follow up on donating materials, or if you have additional questions or would like to get in touch with Pat, feel free to email me and I can assist with that.
Great. I'd love to hear
All
from you.
very much.
Thank you so
Pat.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Bye.